Welcome back to the Farm Show on Westplex Talk 1045 for Saturday, January 24th, 2026. We talked about E15, and I read a statement from the National Corn Growers Association. We also received a statement from the Missouri Corn Growers Association on Thursday. Here's what those folks said. The Missouri Corn Growers Association joins other corn organizations and biofuel groups in expressing frustration with today's decision by leadership in the U.S. House of Representatives to advance a funding bill that omits language allowing year-round nationwide access to E15 fuel. The following statement is from MCGA President Brian Lehman, a corn grower from Versailles, Missouri. Brian says, Missouri corn growers are outraged by Congress's decision to punt year-round E15 once again and instead create a so-called task force. After more than a decade of delays, negotiations, and good faith work by farmers, fuel retailers, ethanol producers, and even the oil industry, Congress knows exactly what needs to be done. We already have a bill. We already have an agreement. At a time when farmers are producing record crops and facing real economic pressure, this move is offensive. This decision sends a clear and troubling message. Congressional leadership is choosing to side with a handful of large refineries instead of hardworking American farmers and consumers. Year-round E15 is a simple, common sense fix to lower fuel costs, strengthen domestic energy security, support rural jobs, and put more American-grown corn to work. The battle isn't over. We'll continue working to break through the blend wall to give drivers greater access to a cleaner, more affordable, domestically produced energy source. We're grateful to the members of Congress who fought with us, especially Congressman Mark Alford, and to every grower who spoke up on this issue. MCGA and partners will continue to push for action in building demand for an American-grown, American-made energy option. Again, that quote is from Missouri Corn Growers Association President Brian Lehman. So, even though there was not satisfactory movement on E15 this week in Congress, there was some satisfactory movement as it relates to Bayer's flagship herbicide Roundup with the active ingredient glyphosate. The Associated Press reported last week, Supreme Court will hear appeal by maker of popular Roundup weed killer to block thousands of lawsuits. This piece was brought to us by Mark Sherman of the Associated Press. Mark writes, the Supreme Court agreed to hear an appeal from global agrochemical manufacturer Bayer to block thousands of state lawsuits, alleging it failed to warn people that its popular weed killer could cause cancer. The justices will consider whether the Environmental Protection Agency's approval of the Roundup weed killer without a cancer warning should rule out the state court claims. The Trump administration has weighed in on Bayer's behalf, reversing the Biden administration's position and putting it at odds with some supporters of the Make America Healthy Again agenda, who oppose giving the company the legal immunity it seeks. Some studies associate Roundup's key ingredient, glyphosate, with cancer, although the EPA has said it is not likely to be carcinogenic to humans when used as directed. The reporter, Mark Sherman, continues, Bayer disputes the cancer claims, but has set aside $16 billion to settle cases. At the same time, it has tried to persuade states to pass laws barring the lawsuits. Georgia and North Dakota have done so. The High Court will take up a case from Missouri in which a jury awarded $1.25 million to a man who developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma after spraying Roundup on a community garden in St. Louis. The Supreme Court in 2022 declined to hear a similar claim from Bayer in a California case that awarded more than $86 million to a married couple. But Germany-based Bayer, which acquired Roundup maker Monsanto in 2018, contends the Supreme Court should intervene now because lower courts have issued conflicting rulings. In 2024, the Third U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in Bayer's favor. Bayer faces about 181,000 Roundup claims, mostly from residential users. It has stopped using glyphosate and Roundup sold in the U.S. residential lawn and garden market, but glyphosate remains in agricultural products. It's designed to be used with genetically modified seeds, including corn, soybeans, and cotton, that resist the weed killer's deadly effect. It allows farmers to produce more while conserving the soil by tilling it less. Bayer has said it might have to consider pulling glyphosate from U.S. agricultural markets if the lawsuits persist. Here's a quote from Bayer's CEO, Bill Anderson, in a written statement. It is time for the U.S. legal system to establish that companies should not be punished under state laws for complying with federal warning label requirements. Environmental groups said Bayer wants to keep juries out of the lawsuits because it keeps losing in state courts. Here's a quote from Lori Ann Bird, the Environmental Health Director at the Center for Biological Diversity. Lori Ann says, "It's a sad day in America when our highest court agrees to consider depriving thousands of Roundup users suffering from cancer of their day in court." The reporter continues, "It's unclear if the case will be argued in the spring or at the start of the next court term in October." Again, that piece is brought to us by the Associated Press, Mark Sherman. Now, for Bayer's point of view, and for Bayer's part, here's what they had to say. The U.S. Supreme Court today, that was last week, announced that it will review the Durnell Roundup case. Monsanto petitioned the court to hear Durnell in April 2025 and address the split in authority among federal circuit courts on the application of federal preemption, a cross-cutting issue in the Roundup litigation. The company expects a decision on the merits during the court's 2026 session, which ends in June. Here's another longer quote and more detailed quote from Bayer CEO Bill Anderson. The Supreme Court decision to take the case is good news for U.S. farmers who need regulatory clarity. It's also an important step in our multi-pronged strategy to significantly contain this legislation. It is time for the U.S. legal system to establish that companies should not be punished under state laws for complying with federal warning label requirements. Every leading regulator worldwide has concluded that glyphosate-based herbicides can be used safely. The Supreme Court previously called for the views of the Solicitor General, who submitted a brief in December on behalf of the United States government, agreeing with the company that the court should hear the case, resolve the circuit split, and rule in the company's favor. In his brief, Solicitor General John Sauer, a Missourian, that's my editorial commentary, argued that upholding the Durnell decision would allow juries to ignore the expert scientific decisions made by the U.S. EPA regarding the safety of glyphosate, saying, quote, EPA has repeatedly determined that glyphosate is not likely to be carcinogenic in humans, and the agency has repeatedly approved Roundup labels that did not contain cancer warnings. This court's intervention is warranted to give FIFRA's preemption provision its proper force. He also warned of the consequences of upholding Durnell, citing a prior Supreme Court holding, writing, quote, where, as here, EPA has specified the health warnings that should appear on a particular pesticide's label, a manufacturer should not be left subject to, quote, 50 different labeling regimes prescribing, end quote, different requirements. In its petition, the company argues that a split among federal circuit courts in the Roundup litigation warrants review and resolution by the country's top court. The Third Circuit Court of Appeals unanimously held in Schaffner that the FIFRA, that's the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, expressly preempts the plaintiff's claims which were based on state failure to warn theories like those in Durnell. And I'm going to skip a bunch more legal talk in here and get to the punchline. In October 2023, Durnell was tried in the Missouri Circuit Court for the city of St. Louis, and the jury returned a verdict in favor of the plaintiff on just one of 3 claims. The jury found the company failed to warn of the product's risk and awarded $1.25 million US dollars, but rejected all other claims and declined to award punitive damages. The company appealed the verdict in August 2024, and the Missouri Court of Appeals Eastern District upheld the verdict in February 2025. Monsanto promptly filed a writ to transfer the case to the Missouri Supreme Court, and it declined review on April 1st, making it ripe for U.S. Supreme Court review. Monsanto filed its petition just 3 days later. So that's the official Bayer statement. As frequent listeners to the Brad and John show here on Westplex Talk 104.5 from 7 to 8 a.m. Monday through Friday, as frequent listeners know, I still hold the position that Bayer will be forced to wave the white flag on glyphosate. Unfortunately, I believe they will dump their glyphosate assets thanks to the litigious pressure and the activist pressure, and Bayer will essentially have to say, "Look what you made us do."
Look what you made me do. Look what you made me do.
Whoa, easy there, Taylor. We don't need any kind of a copyright claim being filed against us. Hey, I'll tell you who's not going to file a copyright claim when we pay homage to their work, and that's the folks at Zimmer Radio Group over in mid-Missouri, Wake Up, Missouri, to be exact. That's Stephanie Bell, Randy Tobler, Brian Houseworth, producer Drake. Drake? That's right, Soulja Boy. Drake. They had former Missouri Farm Bureau President Blake Hurst on earlier this week to talk about Roundup legislation and protecting glyphosate. Here's what Blake had to say as a bit of an introduction.
Well, we on our farm in northwest Missouri, we use Roundup, which is what we're talking about. Roundup on every acre, both for corn and soybeans. It's a broad spectrum herbicide, very mild, very friendly to the environment, and of course, perfectly safe. And the plants that we use it on have been bred to be resistant. So it's an important part of our weed control program. And I guess the other thing that it does is it allows us to no-till farm, meaning we don't disturb the soil, which helps with erosion, helps building soil structure, helps, to use the new term, it's kind of a regenerative practice that builds up the soil. So it's very important to farmers in Missouri.
From there, host Randy Tobler asked Blake about lawsuits involving non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Blake answered those specific questions and then went on to discuss probably the most controversial study about glyphosate, and that would be IARC. Have a listen.
In that question, you assume that there is evidence of those things. Clearly, there are chemicals used on farms and in industry that can cause cancer. Mm-hmm. But as it turns out, Roundup's not one of them. Mm-hmm. Every regulatory agency in the world that's examined it has found it safe. The EPA has found it safe. The only agency, the only study, or a series of studies, actually a mega study, that found some concern was done by a group called the IARC.
Yes.
And the important thing to remember about them is they've examined, almost 1,000 substances, and maybe only found one that they said could or would not cause cancer. Roundup is in the same category as far as cancer causing, and even according to the IARC, Roundup is the same category as coffee. I'm enjoying my coffee this morning. I'm not worrying about the health effects. The average consumer can do the same for Roundup.
If you're just joining us, we're playing select clips from an interview of Blake Hurst, the former president of Missouri Farm Bureau. He was on Wake Up Missouri on Thursday in mid-Missouri. You can find a link to this interview by going to johncombest.com and looking for the Friday, January 23rd headlines. Blake went on to touch on custom applicators, and then Stephanie asked a prescient question about what happens if Missouri farmers don't have access to American-made glyphosate.
Well, and the other thing you need to remember is they've done a long-term study of custom applicators of farm chemicals. In other words, the typical farmer might handle Roundup 1, 2, 3 days a year. These guys handle it for 60 to 90 days a year. They've done a long-term study, found no connection between exposure to Roundup and lymphoma or any other cancer, and that's a gold standard. This stuff, it was developed as a soap. If you open up a jug of Roundup, it smells like soap. It is soap. It is safe. And we need it on our farms here in Missouri.
And it's produced here in the United States. I've heard about the risks that if it's not available to Missouri farmers, that their only other option really is to buy it from out of country, like places like China. Like, what does that product look like?
Well, it's been off patent. We've been using it for many years, so it is available for companies elsewhere in the world to produce. The thing that people need to remember is those companies aren't going to stand behind the product like the U.S. manufacturers will. They're not going to be sticking around if there's ever a problem. So it's really good for our security, our food security, that we be able to have U.S. manufacturers. And what will happen, I personally, and this I'm just speaking for myself, I personally can't believe that anybody still makes it in the U.S. because of the risk of lawsuits. Billions and billions of dollars awarded on the basis of not very good science. And it's frightening for anybody that's in business because we're all vulnerable to lawsuits for the things we do. And we would hope that the jury system would be a little more rational than it has been in this case.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there before we go to break. You can find that full interview, again, by going to either johncombest.com and looking for the Friday, January 23rd, 2026 headlines, or you can go to Apple Podcasts and look up Wake Up Missouri. You can also find those folks on Facebook. When we come back, a big controversy in our 4-county broadcast area. Data centers. What does it even have to do with agriculture? We'll talk about that when we come back.